It is truly a privilege to welcome you to this panel. Today, we're not just discussing emissions, we're exploring how Africa can help drive the global energy transition while securing long-term competitiveness. The challenge is clear. How do we produce oil and gas more responsibly, reduce carbon and methane intensity, and embed sustainability across the value chain? Let's get started. I guess my first question for the panelists is, what does responsible oil and gas production mean in the African context? And how can it be a competitive advantage globally? Khaled, I wanted to start with you maybe to give a bit of context around, the African context in this instance.
Thank you, Beth, and good morning for everybody. And as the upcoming first African president for the International Gas Union, really I'm very honored to deliver my first participation from Africa here. So, and Africa is not just emerging. Africa is becoming the global powerhouse. So there's a lot going on. And at the heart of this growth lie the needed energy and the needed infrastructure. And when we talk about energy, gas is in the middle of all of this. So gas is essential to the human progress, to the global growth, and in Africa specifically, it's so important for the social growth and the economical growth. So this is from one side. From the other side, of course, we as African, we are all responsible and know about the decarbonization and the global responsibility of the pollution. But our share of this pollution is between merely 3 to 4% of globally. And we do understand it. It's not a deniable point. But we need to balance between this ultimate objective that we need, even for our health, for our quality of life, and between the need to build our economy and the ongoing growth in Africa. So these are two major elements that we need to take in consideration.
I wanted to ask you, Richard, I know we had a talk yesterday. What are your thoughts on what responsible oil and gas production is, considering you're with a big oil company?
If you were to ask the protesters outside, they could clearly see a contradiction between responsible and oil and gas producer. On our side, for TotalEnergies, we don't see a contradiction. Definitely, we need energy to develop the humanity. So we intend to continue developing oil and gas, but definitely we want to do it differently. When I say differently from what we used to do decades ago. So differently means we want to do it in a sustainable way. So we speak a lot of sustainability, so it's easy to define. We want to use the resources today for the needs of the humanity today, not to jeopardize the future needs for the future generation. So this is a global statement that everybody agrees on. Practically, it's not so easy. So in TotalEnergies, we have defined a way to address this sustainability issue so that we do it responsibly. So we have several levers. The first one is to reduce the energy consumption for all activities we do. So it's really a mantra we have internally, because the best saving we do is the energy we don't use. Then, definitely, we need energy to produce oil or gas, so we need to reduce the emissions associated to it by reducing the methane emission. I think we'll come back on this, but it is a second level where it is very important to make all the effort we can. So we know it has a cost to do this, to reduce the emissions. It does not come for free. So we are ready to invest. Again, we'll come back on that to make some efforts, economically speaking, to make it happen. Then the third level is environment. We need to minimize the footprint we have on the environment by reducing all the oil in water, for example, that we reject, all the SO2 we emit in the atmosphere, and so on. So technical solutions exist to tend to zero discharge. And then the fourth level is really taking care of the communities we work on to make sure that all the stakeholders benefit from the development of oil and gas. So we are speaking here of local content, of social projects, of embarking the community, so that ultimately there is a fair share of the value creation we do by developing energy.
I wanted to ask about BP next, Kevin. The lessons you've learned with your integrated energy strategy in Europe, which ones are most applicable to sub-Saharan Africa, you think?
It's been an interesting one. So I think there's been lots of lessons looking at the integrated energy strategy in Europe, but I probably would highlight two, which I feel would be great lessons for sub-Saharan Africa. So the recent joint collaboration between BP and its partners, I think we've got Equinor, Shell, TotalEnergies, where we're committing 500 million to create energy access to underserved communities, including sub-Saharan Africa, I think demonstrates the power of sort of joint collaboration and what sort of impact you can have to be able to deliver energy to some of these underserved markets. From an African perspective, I think how that works is to look at how do governments and international oil companies sort of come together in a collaborative way to be able to enhance energy security as well as access. How do you also sort of leverage on private equity funds or international banks, et cetera, to come together as well and create the needed impact to try and remove some of the barriers that we see. The other bit is also, another lesson is sort of looking at renewable energy solutions. So coming into solar home solutions, looking at options where you basically come together and create mini grids, right? Mini grids then allow a lot of sub-Saharan African communities to bypass limitations of national grid without massive capex, without massive limitations getting into the way of energy access to sub-Saharan Africa. So I think these two lessons for me immediately begin to apply to sub-Saharan Africa.
Just staying with you for a second, we had talked a bit about biofuels and used cooking oil. How scalable is that?
Very interesting. So before I get to that, I'll just give you a quick story of BP involvement in used cooking oil. So I'm part of the trading and shipping team in BP, and what we do is, biggest objective is how do we provide fuel supply, security of supply into sub-Saharan African markets. And so that is sort of the primary. We look at the energy demands and we try and deliver fuel. So in Ghana, we looked at a test case of used cooking oil, found a local counterparty who was sort of willing to aggregate used cooking oil. We would essentially offtake that and then take that into our refineries and just basically blend. And what was interesting was we were so confident that we're going to rid the market of used cooking oil. This is waste. Nobody wants that. They will give it to us. And surprise, surprise, there's a whole secondary market of used cooking oil where, when it's all done with the cooking, people are using it for soap making. There's all sort of multiple domestic uses, right? Which meant that we needed to get into that market and actually buy the wastes, and then sort of go into the overall supply chain process. So it's interesting because I think all of that does not take away the value of used cooking oil, but the scalability relies on, one, the economics of it and the readiness of the market, as well as the infrastructure required. To be collecting the volume that we collect requires a lot of logistics, requires a lot of little sort of hotels, street side vendors, secondary schools, etc. All of that collection needs to happen before you sort of ship them or you put them into the refinery. But then you find that to be able to scale, you need to tackle the infrastructure challenges. You need to look at the economic challenges where there's a secondary market. How do you ensure that you don't take away the used cooking oil and basically disenfranchise the economic bits of it as well? I think those are some of the challenges, but it is scalable. It takes time. And while there may be similarities across Africa, there would also be unique differences depending on which African country, the culture, the norms, etc. But indeed, it is scalable.
Kevin mentioned logistics and the complexity around that. So that takes me to you, Andrew. What are your thoughts on creating a more sustainable overall supply chain?
Yeah, thanks, Beth. Transnet provides a range of port infrastructure in South Africa, as well as a series of pipelines that also feed into the region. So that's how we're positioned in the market. So our transition strategy is threefold. The first of those is in the existing liquid fuel market, where obviously the standards for fuel have increased, particularly sulfur, which we discussed before the session. And so our focus there is to bring in smaller players, particularly black-owned players that are either trading or have access to supply chains for refined liquid fuel. So not relying so much on the traditional refineries, two of which are no longer working within South Africa. So that's at a kind of base level. The second area is around LNG. And in this area, we've moved quite fast. We've established an LNG terminal in the port of Richards Bay with a focus on expanding that market up to about 220 cubic meters in phase one and 400 to 600 cubic meters in phase two of LNG imports into South Africa. We take an existing pipeline, which we call the Lily pipeline, which runs from the port of Richards Bay into Gauteng to Durban, and we reposition that. It currently carries methane-rich gas, which, as you know, is very climate destructive. And so it would be repurposed for LNG. We would require some partners around that, so we are considering how to design that transaction model. And the third area, which is probably the most exciting area, is a shift to hydrogen. So the west coast of South Africa, or Southern Africa, Namibia, South Africa, has some of the highest sun intensity in the world. And our focus there is to work with the EU predominantly, establish a port called Bogobai, and then establish an entirely new supply chain for green hydrogen. So it's a sort of threefold strategy that Transnet is working around to change this market, given that we traditionally have invested in the very carbon intensive liquid fuel markets of the past. So we need to kind of reposition ourselves in South Africa and in the region.
You've touched on a lot of different options, including hydrogen, and the hydrogen economy gets talked about, pretty regularly. Dapo, I wanted to ask you, you are kind of at the crux of so many conversations, the investment. I've heard this over and over in the last couple of days. Standard Chartered has committed to mobilizing $300 billion in sustainable finance, aiming for net zero cross-financing activities by 2050 and operations by 2025. How much is that earmarked for oil and gas decarbonization in Africa? Or what can you sort of tell us about this?
Okay, so to sort of give a context as to that target, it's part of a broader set of targets that the bank had set towards achieving net zero in a number of ways by 2050. So it's part of that journey towards that. I think the target or the deployment of the fund is sector agnostic, is technology agnostic, is region agnostic, because there is a recognition that whilst, for example, oil and gas plays a very significant role in the decarbonization journey, the technologies and the pathways to that would vary from, country to country, region to region, and also in terms of the archetype of client, right? So the pathway for an IOC will be very different from an independent company in Africa, will be very different from a national oil company in Asia, right? So the whole context was to have this target, but make it broadly accessible across the various levers of decarbonization. I think it's been, to my mind, fairly successful. I think as at the end of 2024, about $121 billion has been sort of facilitated. And 80% of that has gone to the emerging markets, so Africa, Asia, and Middle East, which is no surprise because it's also aligned with the core areas of the bank's operations. So we're sort of following our clients on the journey of transition using this capital mobilization vehicle or objective to support their journey. There are a few examples of sort of how this has been done. And, it ranges from, supporting large CCS projects in the UK to, deploying capital into a blue ammonia project in Saudi Arabia. If we bring it closer to the African context, it's taking the shape of, supporting significant gas flare reduction projects. A good example is the gas flare reduction project for Basra gas in Iraq, which was done in, I think, 2021-22. It's the largest gas flare reduction project in the world, right? Significant gas flaring molecules converted to a commercial use, right? So it takes different shapes across all the types of decarbonization pathways. Another good example is in Cote d'Ivoire. We put in place a $500 million sustainability-linked loan that was more broadly accessible to support the decarbonization journey in whatever form it takes. Yeah, and that started originally as some form of advisory services, and then we morphed into actually facilitating that funding to be in place alongside the World Bank and IFC into place. So it's a bit of a basket of opportunities in deploying this, and I think there's been a lot of progress in that journey.
And of course, when you have a basket of opportunities, you have to prioritize, right? I'm curious, what makes something bankable? I know that term has been used, again, last 48 hours. I don't know how many times I've heard that term. What makes something bankable?
I think that's a very interesting question. And, I think there's a linkage with the whole concept, especially when you're talking about clean energy, of concessionary financing and blended finance as a tool to unlock that. And, bankers, including myself, sometimes we get guilty of, there's a project and the first thing we're looking at is, how to optimize the cost of funding, get the cheapest capital possible. But what we tend to find is that actually capital follows bankable projects. It's not about the cost of the project or the, engineering the cost of financing specifically, but, it's more so about what are the key drivers or elements of bankability. Now, when we look at what makes a project bankable, is just ensuring that risk allocation across all the players in that ecosystem is appropriately distributed and priced. And if you kind of put it in the context of clean energy, it takes different shapes. It could be as simple as actually having technical support or technical assistance to structure a project properly. It could take the shape of grants. It could take the shape of actually having guarantees, which, in the African context, we see a lot of DFIs providing, and multilateral institutions are very active in that space. And it could take the shape of actually getting concessionary financing. So it's just really about what is required in a specific project context to make the value chain and the deal bankable. If I use the example of some of the large CCS projects in the UK, for example, you'll find that for those projects to actually, and they're quite advanced, and there's a lot of replication that is happening, which means it's scaling. But for that to happen, the key elements of risk that the private sector could not take needed to be absorbed by the government, right? And if you really value that, not in terms of money or just giving financing, but in terms of actually providing the necessary guarantees around things like, what happens if there's a leakage in a sort of well that has been where there's carbon sequestered, that kind of guarantee was provided by the government, and it's really enabled the private sector players to come, including banks, to come, together to actually make those projects come to light. If you actually value that, I think I was reading some estimate of what the value of that guarantee is. You put in a number of almost £5 to £6 billion as to what that guarantee actually provides if you're going to price it in an open market. So it's really finding those areas in the value chain that the commercial players need de-risked and placing what I'll call the risk support, right, in the right places in the value chain. And there's a lot of examples we can give in the African context specifically.
Yeah, very important conversation. I'm sure we'll be continuing for a year or years to come. Richard, I wanted to ask you a bit about the all-electric FPSOs that Total has been deploying. What impact have these technologies had on emissions so far?
In fact, it's not a secret that we need a lot of energy to produce oil and gas, to lift the oil, to inject compressed water, gas, and so on. So definitely there is a strong need. And historically, we used to use a lot of pieces of equipment which were all independent in a way and used some fuel gas to generate their own power. But the trend has been now to neutralize, to put all the power generation in one single place with bigger machines optimized for power generation. So we still use fuel gas when you are on an FPSO at 200 kilometers from the coast, but we have a centralized power generation. And I had to look closer at the FPSO we launched 10 years ago, which was the first full electric we had launched in Angola on Block 17. And when you compare the amount of fuel gas you need to produce 1 unit of oil to the previous FPSO that we had launched only 3 years before, but which was not fully electric, then we gain typically almost 40% of reduction. We have a reduction of 40% of the fuel gas required for the same quantity of oil. So the fact by neutralizing, you gain a lot, you are much more efficient, and in addition, you have an operational efficiency which is much better, because instead of having a lot of independent systems which can fail one after the other, then you have a single one where we focus a lot, and we can compensate with one generator from another one when there is a trip and so on. So this is something we have been implementing for 10 to 15 years now, and it has become systematic given the huge savings we do on energy consumption.
Khaled, I wanted to ask, because TAQA Arabia, I know, is a leader in CNG and solar infrastructure in Egypt. What are the most transferable models for other African countries to you?
Very interesting question, Beth. And let me just say that we in the IGU, we see two things very important here, just before answering about TAQA, is that the gas industry, during the pandemic of the COVID, have proved that to be a very robust and solid industry. We've been delivering gas, producing gas from field on the middle of the pandemic. Hospital didn't have power shortage, so the system is working. This is reliability. Second point, in the IGU, we see Africa as a role model of success stories of implementation of different utilization of gas. And we see in Morocco, ONHIM, we see on Nigeria, a lot of CNG, mobile CNG, and they're all member of the IGU. One of our company, Rosetta, member of the IGU, have just signed a virtual pipeline, which is a mobile LNG transmission in Tanzania to move gas from the pipeline to the industrial zone that are 300, 400 kilometers away from the pipeline. In Mauritania, another member, GoGaz, is implementing a mega integrated project, which is the Banda project, which is gas, goes to the power station and as well goes to the local market and goes through mini LNG scale. So the gas technology enables us today to deliver things that no other source of energy can deliver. TAQA, company that I share, and back to your question, yes, in Egypt, we've been implementing a fantastic mobile CNG. And I'm honored, I've seen the audience, His Excellency Engineer Tarek El Molla, ex-Minister of Oil and Gas, he was a champion with us on this project. So we have developed a strong, reliable system where we don't need to build pipelines sometimes that are not economical or unnecessary with rights of way and so on. But instead of that, using the technology of the mobile CNG and the mobile LNG to transport the gas and make it available to remote area, it could be 500 to 1,000 kilometers. And we have this is one of governorate where we deliver gas to 14,000 families. Housewives, they can cook with clean natural gas. They have their own small gas grid. And then, amazingly, we've seen industry, small and medium-sized SMEs developing around that area, commercial indices of this have developed to do refrigeration. So the fantastic value added economically and socially was not planned originally. And I start to see this now across a lot of countries in Africa. And this is a proof of concept that, and this is for me is very important part of the decarbonization, because in a lot of countries in Africa, they are using, they are burning, cutting the forest, using the wood. So when you bring the gas, you reduce all the CO2 emission, and yes, you replace it with gas that have certain gas emission, but totally not to compare to the other. So we are very proud of what's going on in Africa, and in the IGU, we are building more connection with the financial institution. We are encouraging cross-border cooperation between countries, because this will help reduce. Some countries will have more gas than they need, so they flare the gas, so we can avoid a lot of things. I don't want to elaborate more, to leave more space to my colleagues.
Now, I'm actually going to stay with you because I know you are the incoming president of the International Gas Union. And I wanted to get your thoughts on what global partnerships you're prioritizing that would potentially support Africa's decarbonization journey. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, let me brief it in 5 things. In the IGU, we believe, and the pathway for leadership in the gas is strategic enabler. So moving from no energy to reliable access and diversified and reliable source of energy. Global financing landscape is very important. As we mentioned here, people like Standard Chartered, S&P, and others are the World Bank. So all these global institutions, financial institutions, is very important to have the continuous communication, and this is our role in IGU, to be the platform. We're not going to be a room where we just hear each other as guys. We need to talk to the other stakeholders. It's extremely important to get everybody in an honest and serious discussion. It's not a commercial, it's not an economical, it's for the interests of our society. So an international cooperation on methane management, Africa can lead with support for monitoring, finance, and capacity. Of course, and we totally believe in the IGU that gas is complementary with renewable. We ensure together a continuity. We cannot depend. We have seen the model that's happening on totally 100% depending on renewable in Spain last year. So, but we believe on the mix of energy and the integration. And finally, as I already said, the regional cooperation, harmonized policy, and cross-border project can enhance resilience on decarbonization. So these are the major elements which we in IGU are targeting to deliver.
Thank you. Richard, I wanted to ask you, because I know that there is a way that TotalEnergies looks at the projects it's going to get involved in. I believe there's a bit of a ratio, CO2 to per bill. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, in fact, so we are convinced that we need to go on decarbonization, on the decarbonization pathway, and we know it has a cost, as I said earlier on. So what we have set up as an internal rule for several years now is that for every project, we look at the additional costs required to remove some CO2, and we compute the case without this additional investment, and the case with additional investment, which allows to reduce the CO2. And we compute a ratio, and we see how many dollars per ton we invest to reduce the CO2. And as long as a project has a cost of less than $100 per ton, we are ready, we do, and we launch this project, even if, whatever the country, whatever we are in Europe, in the US, in Africa, in Asia, we don't take into account the fact that there is a carbon price in some countries or not, and not in others. We do as if there was a cost of carbon, even if it is theoretical, but practically we launch this project and we are ready to reduce our margin in a way by launching this project. So we do not do decarbonization at any cost. We have this quantitative evaluation, and the threshold is set as $100 per ton. This value of $100 per ton is typically the price of carbon in Europe on the market. So this is why this is something that could evolve in the future. The cost of carbon in countries where it has a cost increases. we will probably review this threshold, but we try to align with a market-based price. And again, we are ready to invest more so that we are more responsible when producing oil and gas.
Kevin, BP's trading and shipping arm is central to energy flow across Africa. How is it evolving to support decarbonization while maintaining supply reliability? It's that balance that seems to be so hard.
It is. It's not an easy balance to achieve, especially when the focus is to be able to get out as much petroleum products as possible to the market. But I think what I've seen that we're doing in most of the sub-Saharan African markets is trying to deliver low sulfur options. So over the years, you would see that in markets in West Africa and some other markets, we've moved from high sulfur type of distillates into very low sulfur, which is, I guess, one step into making sure that you create a balance. The other bit is also, while delivering the resilient hydrocarbons, also looking at investments in renewable infrastructure, looking at alternative fuels for our shipping fleet. I remember a few years ago, we were one of the big champions of IMO 2020, which was effectively trying to move heavy fuel for ships and sort of looking at lighter fuel options. There's also the agenda of trying to use renewables to get into sustainable aviation fuel. These are taking time to materialize. There's a lot of investments. We're looking into hydrogen and things like that. So I think what we're trying to do is focus more on energy security, energy access, but also have a dual track system that allows you to have equal amounts of investments in renewable energy options. That may not necessarily reduce carbon intensity by much today, but over time, you will build that muscle or that significant base to be able to reduce it. So that's sort of how we're doing it from a TNS perspective. Deliver, but also begin to invest in renewable energy options, infrastructure, storage, etc.
Andrew, similar question for you. How's Transnet balancing the sustainability with reliability question?
I guess our challenge is we have to transition as the market transitions because we're really part of the supply chain. So we provide the port, the rail, and the pipeline infrastructure. So if the market transitions faster, we can respond faster. At this point, we've actually been delayed to the transition to LNG, so we are very aware of that. And through a partnership in the port of Richards Bay, and then further partnerships in the port of TAQA and in Saldanha, which is just outside of Cape Town, we would like to change that position and sort of reposition LNG still faster. When it comes to hydrogen, our challenge there is we really require the full infrastructure to be developed. And part of the challenge of bankability there is you have massive forward investments, but you have to generate huge volumes of product in order to pay those big capital investments off. And we just can't get that to connect at this point in time. So the challenge for us around the hydrogen market and investing behind that is that the capital investment requirements up front are so large that no one really wants to take a punt on them. And the country is not able to. Some of the outside investors like the EU, I think, are still hesitant about what their role will be in that hydrogen economy. So re-establishing those or establishing from new those supply chains requires somebody to really take a big upfront knock for a later return, which may only be 10 to 15 years away, even longer.
And it sounds like the partnership piece is extremely important for pretty much everybody on the panel, I think.
Yes.
You know, as things are evolving. Dapo, I wanted to ask you, several major banks have exited the net zero banking alliance. I know Standard Chartered remains. Can you talk a bit more about the status of that, what it is, what it's becoming, that kind of thing?
Yep, just very briefly. I think you're right. SCB remains a part of the organization, despite the fact that a few banks have existed. The reality is that the NZBA is changing, in terms of what it constitutes, what it means for members. And in fact, they've actually moved from a membership model. So actually, when you go to the NZBA website, there's no list of members anymore because it's moving from, being an organization that has certain requirements for banks and institutions to be a member of it, to more sort of advisory, standard-setting organization to, kind of provide standards that banks and institutions can voluntarily subscribe to and adopt as it fits their context in the decarbonization journey. So it's kind of shifting from that. Yes, some banks have left, will remain, but the point is, it's moving from, this very rules-based membership organization to, this is how we undertake the journey and, providing standards and guidance and, whatever support institutions need as part of that journey.
So it sounds like it's still important to come together. The financing is so key to unlocking everything, right? So keeping that organization alive, keeping the sort of everyone working in the same direction is an important thing to keep going. I wanted to ask, I know we have a few minutes left. I wanted to ask everyone, how do you balance short-term energy needs with long-term decarbonization goals, especially in regions where energy access is still a challenge? Anyone who wants to tackle that, how do you balance short-term energy needs with long-term decarbonization? Richard, I have a feeling you have a thought.
So definitely it relates to sustainability again, because we have needs today, but our grandchildren will have needs tomorrow. So we cannot allocate the first priority to the short-term needs only. So we are convinced there is a need to be more sustainable. So in our case, again, it's we are fully embarked on the decarbonization. We know it has a cost. We are ready to make our own effort as an investor. We think everybody of the whole humanity should make an effort. We know it's not that easy, but it's something. It is really a must, and we owe this to the future generation. So, in terms of balance, we have made a choice. So we cannot cannot give priority only to the short term. We need to balance, and we need to have this long-term view when investing, and even if it costs a bit more.
Go for it, Kevin.
I'll make it simple. I think prioritize energy access. I think that's fundamental. There must be energy access. There must be energy security. And if you do that, you can then look at investing in low carbon infrastructure and also working with policy regulatory partnerships to be able to deliver that. That would be a quick answer to that.
Okay. Anyone else want to give it a shot?
Yeah, maybe.
Go for it, Andrew.
From our standpoint, what we do is we provide the supply chain infrastructure. But what seems to have worked in other countries is in some kind of incentive program to, say, get people to shift from petrol vehicles to electric vehicles. I think the same logic would apply to LNG, where you ask requesting people to shift from traditional fuels to LNG, and then from LNG to, say, hydrogen. Somebody needs to create an incentive to create that shift, because it requires, from a user perspective, somebody to invest behind a change in energy use. And without those kind of incentives, I think it's very difficult for people. It's very sticky. People will just stay with what they have. So from our standpoint, creating some structure of incentives globally, both in developed and developing countries, is really critical to getting an energy shift.
I have another one for everyone. Get ready. If you had to name one bold move, doesn't have to be too bold, for Africa's oil and gas sector to make in, say, the next 12 months or so to lead on decarbonization, what would that be? Dapo, you want to start?
Yeah, maybe I start. And I'm sort of riding on what the gentleman from TAQA mentioned around trying to create those gas linkages for intra-Africa trade. I think the really bold move, and I know you said 12 months, but it's a journey. I think it's about getting serious about using Africa's gas resources for African projects and consumption. I think earlier today there was a panel that was talking about, is there still a room for Africa gas in the global LNG market? And I think it's, almost to flip the narrative to say, is there a space, or can African gas be used for African demand, right? And, asking the serious questions around, why a mining project in Sierra Leone or in Guinea uses diesel, which is imported, or LPFO, when you can get gas in there to make it more clean, more efficient, and even more bankable in some instances. Why the Kenya LPG market relies on imported LPG, and even Nigeria as well, when there's abundant resource. So it's really about, to my mind, asking those questions and, get the momentum going in executing projects and those linkages that ensure that Africa can really monetize its gas resources. And I think, I'm really gladdened a bit about some of the comments he made earlier around those linkages, because people tend to think it's about doing big 6,000 kilometer pipelines, but no, it could be a virtual pipeline system. It's just about having that mindset that there is a lot of gas resources on the continent, there are deficit areas, there are surplus areas. How do you bring all of that together in a way that actually can pull the continent into an energy sufficient or even surplus region?
I think we have time for one more person to try that. Richard.
Okay.
What one bold move in your mind?
So first of all, I'm based in Angola, and I want to first start to commend the recent change of law made by the authorities to promote the development of incremental production. So using the existing facilities to develop brownfields. Because generally speaking, when you add some additional development, add some tiebacks, some infill wells, by using the existing facilities, you don't create additional carbon emission. Usually it's quite neutral. So it's a good move that the state helps investors to develop this type of resources. After that, in order to go outside of Angola and more broadly, we are in favor in TotalEnergies of carbon pricing all over the places. I mentioned it exists in Europe, as you know. And it should, I think it could be and it should be done in Africa and everywhere else in the world, not only on oil and gas, obviously, but over all the type of activities, so that we really take into account the indirect cost of carbon emission for the planet, and so that we can redirect some more investment in cleaner energies. So doing better for oil and gas, but also promoting solar renewable investment and so on. So we are really in favor of carbon pricing in Africa and all over the places.
I think that's a great way to end it. Thank you very much, panelists, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.